Imagine the sound of a fist slamming down on a polished wooden table in Addis Ababa. Not just any hand, but that of the brand new chair of the African Union, a man only 3 months into his mandate already shaking the world with words as sharp as thunder. Mahmud Ali Yu, the Lion of Djibouti, stood tall in the very hall where generations before had dreamed of a free Africa, and he declared something almost unthinkable in today's polite diplomacy: reparations. Justice. A reckoning with centuries of plunder that scarred not only Africa, but the Caribbean too. For the elders watching from across the Atlantic, it was as if the voices of Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah had been called back to life. His demand was not wrapped in gentle words. He called out the truth that maps have long shrunk Africa to appear smaller, that schoolbooks still erase her stories, that corporations still bleed her minds dry. And when he spoke, you could hear the gasp ripple across the room. But here's the question that echoes louder than applause: is you the liberator Africa has been waiting for, or just another bold talker destined to be tamed by old powers? History reminds us that visionaries are often silenced, sometimes by coups, sometimes by bullets, sometimes by the invisible chains of debt and dependency. And yet, for the first time in decades, Africa and her Caribbean family stood united, demanding justice not as charity, but as the return of what was stolen. Brothers and sisters, this is not just another summit. It is a spark, and sparks can light fires. The question is, will this fire be nurtured into a flame that brings warmth, or will it be smothered by those afraid of its light? If you believe that the truth matters more than headlines, if you want to be among the first to stand with leaders like Yu and President Ibrahim Traoré in their struggle for real sovereignty, then stay with us. Please share this message and subscribe, because history is not only being written, it is being reclaimed. The year was 2025, and the city of Addis Ababa, long considered the beating heart of African diplomacy, was once again the stage of history. Inside the Grand Nelson Mandela Hall at the headquarters of the African Union, the air felt heavier than usual. Flags of African nations and Caribbean islands swayed side by side, marking a reunion centuries in the making. Leaders from across 2 continents, divided by oceans but united by memory, gathered for what was called the AU CARICOM Summit. But no one could have anticipated the moment that would ignite it. Mahmud Ali Yu, the new chairperson of the African Union and president of Djibouti, had been in office for just 3 months. To many, he was still an unknown. Yet in that hall, with presidents, prime ministers, and envoys from the United Nations seated before him, Yu revealed the kind of leader he intended to be. He did not bow. He did not whisper. He slammed his hand against the table and delivered a declaration that reverberated across the chamber. Excellencies, let us jointly demand that former colonial powers acknowledge historic crimes, offer meaningful reparations, and dismantle structural injustice. For a brief second, there was silence, an almost stunned disbelief. Then came the applause, hesitant at first, then rolling through the hall like a wave. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of centuries. Yu reminded the assembly that political independence alone had never been enough. Africa and the Caribbean remained trapped in the structures built by colonialism, unfair trade deals, stolen wealth economies chained to foreign debts. The message was unmistakable: this summit would not be symbolic. It would be a battlefield for memory and justice. Yu went further than anyone expected. Just days earlier, he had already made global headlines by demanding that the world's maps stop shrinking Africa. That seemingly small detail, he argued, was a psychological weapon, teaching generations of children that Africa was less significant, less powerful, less vast than it truly is. Even our geography has been colonized, he thundered, and many in the hall nodded in recognition. What he sought was not only reparations in money, but also the restoration of dignity, identity, and truth. The presence of international dignitaries gave the moment additional weight. Paranga Anyanga, the United Nations representative to the AU, stood to speak on behalf of Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. He echoed Yu's call, acknowledging what he called 2 colossal compounded injustices. First, the slave trade, whose bitter fruits continue to poison lives across the diaspora. Second, the creation of the global economic system during the colonial era, a system that still locks Africa and the Caribbean on the margins. It is high time for reparatory justice frameworks to be put in place, Guterres' words declared, read aloud to the packed chamber. For many listening, the gravity of the moment was undeniable. From Prime Minister Terence Drew of St. Kitts and Nevis to President João Lourenço of Angola, leaders leaned forward in their seats. Carla Barnett, Secretary-General of CARICOM, called the gathering a homecoming, a reunion of families separated by chains and ships, but never by spirit. She reminded everyone that CARICOM had long been at the forefront of the reparations movement, and now Africa itself was joining that fight in full voice. It was not just speeches. It was a covenant being renewed. Yu's insistence on reparations linked past atrocities to present realities, the mining contracts that strip the Congo, the land grabs that displace Zimbabwean farmers, the curricula that still elevate European histories above African ones. He spoke not just of past theft, but of ongoing plunder, and for that the applause was mixed with murmurs of unease. Some leaders knew the implications pushing too hard could mean retaliation from Western capitals, the loss of aid, the tightening of financial nooses. Still in that hall for a fleeting moment, unity prevailed. Africa and the Caribbean declared their shared destiny. The summit was no longer a diplomatic formality, it had become a turning point, a chance to reclaim what was taken, and to honor ancestors whose bones lie in unmarked graves across the Atlantic. For the people watching from the streets of Accra, the markets of Port-au-Prince, and the digital cafes of Nairobi, the message was electrifying. Justice was no longer a whisper, it was a demand. Reparations were no longer a dream, they were on the table. And at the center of it all stood Mahmud Ali Yu, invoking the spirit of leaders like Sankara and Ibrahim Traoré, daring to speak truths that many feared to utter. The summit had begun with protocol, but after Yu's speech, it had become history. The air inside the Nelson Mandela Hall shifted from ceremony to confrontation the moment Mahmud Ali Yu's hand hit the table. That single gesture, amplified by his uncompromising demand for reparations, marked the high point of the summit. It was not just the words, but the defiance, the boldness, the refusal to let history remain unspoken. This was the climax of decades of silence breaking. Delegates exchanged looks, some filled with pride, others with anxiety. Younger leaders applauded with fire in their eyes, while older officials whispered, calculating the diplomatic costs. Outside the hall, the reaction was immediate. Across the continent, social media lit up with hashtags, or true size of Africa, yek reparations. Now, justice for ancestors. From Lagos to Kingston, from Nairobi to Bridgetown, young Africans and Caribbeans shared maps that finally displayed the continent's real size. It was more than cartography. It was psychological liberation, a reclaiming of truth after centuries of distortion. In the streets of Accra University, students gathered in cafes debating what reparations might look like: scholarships to rebuild Africa's universities, debt cancellation, or direct funds for hospitals and green energy projects. In Port-au-Prince, activists pointed to Haiti's infamous independence debt, to France, a cruel burden that drained the island for more than a century. In London, descendants of the Windrush generation invoked Yu's speech to demand justice from Britain for broken promises and systematic betrayals. The diaspora felt seen, heard, and connected. For the first time, their struggles were not separate battles, but part of one global movement, tied together by Yu's thunderous words. But hope was laced with caution. Older generations who had lived through moments of promise before whispered names heavy with history: Patrice Lumumba silenced by foreign bullets, Thomas Sankara betrayed by a friend and gunned down for daring to speak too boldly, Kwame Nkrumah toppled in a coup that many still suspect was orchestrated by foreign powers. These memories lingered like shadows over the hall. Would Yu suffer the same fate? Would the AU bureaucracy and the old guard dilute his vision until it became just another resolution gathering dust? Even inside the summit, skepticism surfaced. Some leaders, their economies still tethered to Western loans and aid, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew the risks cutting too deeply into old wounds could provoke retaliation from Washington, Paris, or London. Aid might be withheld, sanctions whispered, investment quietly withdrawn. Yu's boldness was an inspiration to many, but it was also a threat to those who had long managed Africa's delicate dance with dependency. Meanwhile, outside of Africa and the Caribbean, the reactions rippled. In European capitals, diplomats scrambled to draft cautious responses, wary of being directly accused, yet unwilling to concede ground. Editorials in Western media outlets painted Yu as either a visionary or a reckless populist. In the United States, the conversation was split. Caribbean American communities hailed the speech as historic, while policy analysts worried it might strain ties with African governments. And yet, despite the doubts, the symbolism of the moment could not be undone. Yu had thrown down a gauntlet. He had forced the world to look directly at the wounds of slavery, colonialism, and exploitation not as abstract history, but as living injustices with ongoing consequences. Reparations were no longer a fringe idea. They were the centerpiece of an official continental and transcontinental demand. For ordinary people, that mattered. In Nairobi's tech hubs, young innovators began to imagine how reparations could fund African-designed AI solar grids or water systems independent of Western control. In Zimbabwe's villages, farmers spoke of land taken under colonial rule and how justice could finally mean security for their children. Across the Caribbean, cultural leaders declared that reparations would not only rebuild economies, but restore dignity, an acknowledgement that their ancestors' suffering was not forgotten. The summit hall had become a stage of history, but the true drama was unfolding outside in the conversations of millions. Yu's gesture, his fist on the table, had become a symbol, a rallying cry, an image seared into memory. Whether seen as a grenade tossed into global politics or a beacon of liberation, it had already changed the narrative. Africa and the Caribbean were no longer asking politely. They were demanding united, and the world could not unhear them. This was the high tide of the summit, the point where hope, fear, pride, and defiance collided. And for the first time in generations, it felt as if Africa and her diaspora were breathing the same breath, speaking with the same voice, daring the world to answer. When the applause inside Addis Ababa finally faded, the consequences of Yu's declaration began to ripple far beyond the summit hall. His words were not just political theater, they were seeds, and they began sprouting almost instantly in civil society politics and the cultural imagination of millions. In Africa, the first wave of impact came from the youth. Across universities in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, students organized forums titled Reparations and Our Future. For a generation often dismissed as disinterested in politics, Yu's speech was a wake-up call. They no longer saw governance as an arena reserved for elites. Instead, they saw it as a weapon to reclaim dignity. Civil society groups, many led by young women and community organizers, began drafting manifestos on how reparations could be directed into healthcare, education, and infrastructure. In Ouagadougou, young activists even cited President Ibrahim Traoré's model of using national resources to fund schools and housing as proof that sovereignty was possible without Western permission. For ordinary citizens, the demand for reparations unlocked conversations long buried. Families in Congo spoke openly about mining contracts that had displaced entire villages. In Zimbabwe, farmers pointed to stolen lands that still bore foreign ownership. In Namibia, descendants of the Herero genocide called for tribunals to finally acknowledge atrocities once brushed aside as colonial incidents. The summit had given them language, legitimacy, and a sense that their grievances were not isolated, but part of a collective struggle. Politically, however, the effects were more complicated. Within the African Union itself, lines began to form. A bloc of leaders, mostly from reformist or younger governments, rallied behind Yu's vision. They saw the reparations movement as a chance to break the continent free from IMF dictates and the chokehold of old colonial economies. But others, especially leaders whose states depended heavily on Western aid or security guarantees, grew uneasy. They feared sanctions, investment withdrawal, or even covert destabilization. For them, Yu's bold stance was inspiring but dangerous, like playing with fire in a room full of dry straw. Caribbean leaders faced similar pressures. While Prime Minister Terence Drew of St. Kitts and Nevis and others voiced solidarity, they knew too well the financial vulnerability of their small island nations. Debt, climate disasters, and dependency on tourism left them exposed. Yet the very fragility of their economies also strengthened their argument. Reparations were not optional charity, but moral and historical justice. Beyond government chambers, the cultural consequences were profound. Schools across Africa and the Caribbean began reviewing curricula, with educators arguing that history could no longer be Eurocentric. Museums debated how to display artifacts stolen during colonial rule. Artists, poets, and musicians turned Yu's fist on the table into a motif of resistance, an image appearing in murals from Dakar to Kingston. But there were dangers too. In Western capitals, whispers of retaliation grew louder. Some financial institutions hinted at reevaluating partnerships. Analysts warned of political instability in countries pushing too hard. The same old patterns of pressure loomed, reminding everyone that the fight for reparations would not be welcomed by those who had benefited most from exploitation. Still, for millions of ordinary people, the summit created something harder to suppress than speech's belief. Belief that colonial injustice could be confronted, belief that unity across oceans was possible, and belief that leaders like Yu and in his own sphere President Ibrahim Traoré represented a generation of Africans no longer willing to bow their heads. The civil and political consequences were therefore twofold: hope crystallized into action and resistance crystallized into caution. The battlefield of reparations had been opened, and neither Africa nor the Caribbean could retreat without losing face. For the first time in decades, it felt like the chains of history were not just being remembered, they were being challenged link by link. While Africa and the Caribbean celebrated the summit as a turning point, the rest of the world reacted with a mix of unease, curiosity, and denial. Western capitals, Washington, London, Paris, were quick to release carefully worded statements praising dialogue while avoiding the word reparations. Beneath the diplomatic language lay a clear fear: if Africa and the Caribbean truly united around this demand, it could set off a chain reaction capable of shaking the global financial order. In the United States, the reactions were especially layered. Caribbean American communities hailed the speech as historic, holding rallies in Brooklyn, Miami, and Atlanta, where banners read, "Reparations, now justice delayed is justice denied." African American activists, long engaged in their own reparations movement, saw Yu's words as a global echo of their struggle. Some pointed out that if Washington continues to deny reparations for slavery at home, how could it ever support such claims abroad? American policymakers, however, viewed the situation differently. Analysts in think tanks warned that Yu's stance might push Africa further into the arms of rivals like China and Russia, who would not hesitate to support reparations rhetoric if it meant undermining Western influence. The Pentagon quietly flagged the AU-CARICOM alliance as a potential geopolitical flashpoint, especially in regions where U.S. military presence was already contested. Economic advisors worried about the precedent: if reparations were granted, what would stop other regions, Latin America, South Asia, the Middle East, from making similar claims against centuries of colonial exploitation? European nations were equally unsettled. France, with its colonial history in both Africa and the Caribbean, faced immediate scrutiny. Commentators resurrected Haiti's independence debt, a humiliation that Paris has never fully acknowledged. Britain, already under pressure from the Windrush scandal, was cornered by Yu's direct reference to colonial betrayals. Editorials in The Guardian and Le Monde admitted that the moral case for reparations was strong, but politicians remained wary of opening a legal and financial Pandora's box. Meanwhile, in the Global South, the summit was greeted with solidarity. Latin American leaders, especially in Brazil and the Caribbean diaspora, echoed Yu's demand, recalling their own histories of slavery and colonial extraction. South Asian commentators noted parallels with India's demands for the return of treasures and artifacts stolen by the British Empire. The world was witnessing a potential shift. Reparations was no longer just an African or Caribbean question, but a global one. At the center of this international storm, one figure emerged as a symbolic anchor: President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Though not the summit's main speaker, his name surfaced repeatedly in debates. Analysts noted how Traoré's policies, nationalizing resources, expelling exploitative corporations, investing in housing and education, were already a form of reparations by action rather than by negotiation. To many, Yu's thunderous call and Traoré's quiet reforms represented two fronts of the same movement, one demanding justice from the world, the other building justice at home. For the United States, this raised a pressing question: should Washington resist this rising tide or engage with it? Some argued that acknowledging even symbolic reparations could repair decades of mistrust. Others insisted that yielding would weaken American influence and empower rivals. The debate remained unresolved, but one thing was clear: Yu's fist on the table had reverberated far beyond Addis Ababa. It had reached the Oval Office, the Élysée Palace, and Downing Street, forcing world powers to confront a truth they had long buried. And so the world watched, torn between fear and admiration. Reparations was no longer a whisper of activists. It was the demand of nations. As the echoes of the summit fade, one truth remains: Africa and the Caribbean have placed reparations at the very center of global politics. No longer whispered in classrooms or debated in activist circles, the demand now stands at the highest tables of diplomacy. But history warns us such boldness comes with danger. Leaders like Lumumba, Sankara, and Nkrumah paid dearly for daring to dream. Will Mahmud Ali Yu face the same fate? Will his fire be smothered by the weight of old powers and compliant elites? For ordinary people, this is more than politics, it is survival. Reparations mean hospitals that finally open their doors, schools that teach African history without apology, and economies no longer chained to debt. Yet if this movement falters, the consequences will be severe. Dependency will deepen, exploitation will continue, and the chains of the past will tighten once more. This is why the question before us is not just about Yu's speech, but about our collective will. Will Africa and her diaspora from Harlem to Havana, from Dakar to Kingston sustain this fire? Or will it be allowed to die out, another headline lost in the archives? Brothers and sisters, the story is not finished. It is still being written by leaders like you, by reformers like President Ibrahim Traoré, and by you, the people who choose to watch, to remember, and to act. So I ask you, do you believe this moment can become a movement? Do you believe Africa and the Caribbean can reclaim not just stolen wealth, but stolen dignity? If you do, then please share this video so others can join the conversation, and subscribe if you believe, as I do, that the truth is more important than the headlines. History is calling, let us answer together.